Any fool can have a child. That doesn't make you a father. It's the courage to raise a child that makes you a father. President Barack Obama. This is Dadography, a podcast with stories and insights on fatherhood from dads around the globe, dedicated to providing you with the tools and tips to become a better dad. I'm your host, Corey Wood. Today's guest is a good friend of mine for 15 plus years, one of the first African-American journalists on the local station there in Jacksonville, Florida, where I'm originally from, Mr. Ben Frazier. Ben, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thank you so very, very much for having me on this show. I am totally thrilled that this is a program that goes around the world and takes a perspective from people from around the world. It's not just one particular geography, not just one little area, but taking on this overarching question of what it's like to be a father. And it is my pleasure.
Yeah, man. Well, it's so good to have you here, Ben. I got to tell you, I've been looking forward to, just talking to you and seeing what fruits I can pick off the trees of your experience. Why don't you take a few moments, man, and tell the guests a little bit about yourself?
Well, let me start off in the city of Jacksonville, Florida. It's a very large city, about 1 million people or so, about 280,000 Black folks who call it home. I was born and raised here, age 70. So my experience goes back to the days of segregation in the South. I was born in a hospital that was for people of my color, my race. You couldn't be born just in any hospital back in June of 1950. I remember the parks. I remember the swimming pools. I remember public accommodation with regard to restaurants where you could sleep in hotels. And you couldn't do that just anywhere. As I grew up to the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, when I was 10, 15 years old, it was a strange time. People treated you differently. People looked at you differently. They sized you up, looked you over, and they never considered for one moment the content of your character, but instead, they looked at only the color of your skin. So, with that experience coming up in terms of school, I went to school at an all-black school. I lived in an all-black neighborhood. All of my experiences were uniquely based on race and segregation for the first 20 or so years of my life. Never had friends of any different color other than blacks. In fact, I remember in our neighborhoods, there were white folks who lived down and around on the other side of the major highway. And we knew somehow that we weren't supposed to like them, and they knew somehow that they weren't supposed to like us. And we were children. And that is what they were breeding and fostering and raising us like, to hate one another, both black and white, to treat each other differently. That was a strange experience. So it is there that I grew up, got into the business of radio after being in drama in high school, and then getting married. Got married and had the esteemed honor of taking part in bringing two wonderful people into the world. My daughter first, Kelly, my son, Benjamin the Third, who now has a Benjamin the Fourth, I might add. So that was it in the early days, getting married, living in cities like Jacksonville, Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, living in New Orleans, Louisiana.
You lived in New Orleans, Louisiana. Was that with the entire family, or was that just a period with just
No,
you
that
and
was a
your wife?
period actually in a first marriage. I've been married twice, and with my first wife, I lived in New Orleans, but only for a period of about a year
Okay.
before moving on.
And you two did not have any children, is that correct?
No, we did not have any children. I was too much into my career and didn't really have children and baby making on my mind. Moved from New Orleans to Washington, D.C. And it was in Washington, D.C., after being there for a period of about 3 years, that I remarried. And in the first year of our marriage, we had a baby girl named Kelly. And then much later, after living in Washington, D.C., moving to Detroit, Michigan.
Now, were you two planning on having a baby, or was Kelly unexpected?
No, she was a planned pregnancy, and we looked forward to Kelly joining us in the world. And it was a grand experience as we were two young people, two young professionals starting out in the world. And it was great. We moved from our living life as singles to being parents of a brand new baby girl.
That's quite a transition. At that time, were you still on the radio in Jacksonville, or I
Well,
know you were
actually, I was
moving?
doing national radio at the time on the Mutual Broadcasting System and on Armed Forces Radio and 500 naval ships at sea. And we lived in D.C. for a while, but then on to television in Detroit, Michigan. So with Kelly, we had that Detroit, Michigan experience, and with my son, Benji the Third as well. We were living in Detroit, Michigan, where they make cars. They call it the Motor City, Motown, and all that jazz.
So at this juncture now, you've done radio, you've done television, and you're doing nationally syndicated radio, and you guys are living in Detroit. What type of activities during that time frame? I mean, you guys, for all intents and purposes, are celebrities at that time. What type of activities did you guys do with the kids?
Well, Detroit was a grand experience of television and all the ego, I suppose, any person could ever have of driving around the expressways and seeing your picture on billboards and that sort of thing. It was a heady experience being able to travel with the stars and to meet people like Michael Jackson and Aretha Franklin and other people, movie stars and politicians. It was heady. It was a big egotistical lift, I suppose, at that time to be on television. We did a lot of speaking engagements, talking about history and discussing political issues and dealing with entertainment. So yeah, it was a grand experience in Detroit. Detroit is a very Afrocentric sort of place,
Mm-hmm.
and we had fun there.
Now, during this time, I'd like to try to, I guess, try to encapsulate what you're experiencing. I mean, you're a Southern guy from Jacksonville, Florida. You have gotten onto television, radio, and you've transitioned now to Detroit, Michigan after Washington. So you're getting some experience outside of your normal scheme of things. What was it like, Ben, to be with two children at that time? This is, it seems like it may have been or could have been the time of your life. but you've got two children at the time. What was that like?
Well, the children were very young in experience in Detroit. They're like 3 and 4 years old. And I was so busy that I don't think I gave them the time I should have given them. Now, we did spend some time together and playing, but for the most part, that was Josephine's work because I was speaking. There would be times when I literally had 3 newscasts a day, and in between, sometimes 2 speaking engagements. I think one year I did like 200 speaking engagements. It was a lot, and there was a lot of stress on Josephine. She at one time said that all I want to do is have your children, be your wife. But I'll tell you what, when all you have to deal with all day long is 2 kids who can barely talk, it becomes a bit of a strain if you don't have some support on the other end. I was living my professional life trying to be a good dad, but not spending nearly the amount of time that I needed to, good quality time with my children at that impressionable age between, say, 3 and 6 years old.
We've actually had
That
a
was
couple of dads on the podcast, and taking a look through the lens of hindsight, we have been repeatedly encouraged to spend more time with our kids. That's been the insight from the show a couple of times now. Let's go back just a little bit, Ben, before we get into a little bit more of your fathering. Help me to know a little bit about your dad, and I do that so I can get an opportunity to see what type of generational good lessons you got from your dad that have gone down to your children. And so tell me a little bit about your dad.
Well, Dad was a great provider. He was a Baptist minister. He was a postman delivering the mail. He believed in providing for his children, and he must have had some experience in his own childhood, perhaps where his dad did not do what he was supposed to do. My dad was a stickler. He was real strict. He would come home in the evening and mumble something like, "Good evening." And he would say to Mom, "Tell that boy to bring me something cold to drink." And he would say it in a almost godlike voice. And as a child, I remember coming up to him with that glass of cold drink, Kool-Aid or whatever, almost shaking as I approached his room door and offering it to him like he was a king on a throne. I was afraid of my father for most of my life. He had a big, booming voice, and when he spoke, we all knew to listen. That's probably the most definitive thing I remember about him more than anything else. But all in all, I give him good marks as a father, particularly as it relates to taking care of his family, taking care of his children, teaching us responsibility and that we have to be held accountable for our choices, our decisions, our actions. And he gave me the basics in terms of doing what is right.
These lessons come in the form of being sat down on the couch and talked to. Were they on the tail end of you doing something wrong, and then the result was the lesson? What was his teaching style? It sounds like, despite being a strict disciplinarian, he had some very positive life lessons to give. But how were those messages delivered?
He delivered them with his postal belt that was 48 inches long. And when I did wrong, he pulled out the belt and he would punish me to the extent that sometimes my mother would have to pull him from off of me and tell him to stop. My dad's idea was that, hey, listen, you don't do wrong. And if you do, this is what you'll get. I remember classic lesson of bringing home a quarter and being so proud, telling him that I found a quarter on the street. And he said very casually and quietly in his way, did I give you that quarter? No, sir. Did your mom give you that quarter? No, sir. He said, then that quarter is not yours. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to take that quarter back and you're going to put it in the exact spot that you found it. Well, the lights were on outside, which means it was dark. And I remember my mom very passionately saying to my father, Benjamin, it's dark outside. That boy has no business going back out there to put a quarter where you say he should put it. My father, in his very casual and strong voice, said, Still, you're right. You go back with it.
Oh,
Make sure
man.
you put it in the right spot.
I got a clear picture
That was there.
of him now, for sure. For sure, I've got a clear picture of him. Well, let's fast forward. Let's go back to Detroit. We are in the Motor City. You are mingling with politicians and celebrities. You've gotten Emmys to your credit at this point. You're married and 2 children. So what transpired during this period? When meeting and spending time with so many celebrities and just being in such an awesome place at that time?
The fact of the matter is, I was traveling in what some would say is the fast lane. I was living life on the edge. I was living with people who did not have living the righteous life on their minds. These are people who were dealing in, shall we say, the wrong areas. They had all kinds of business deals that were not right, drinking and drugging and living the fast life on their minds. It was all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That was the experience, and I became embroiled.
So you're embroiled in this experience. Wife, 2 kids, everybody's far away from home. Help me to see now. Obviously, birds of a feather flock together. So the things that they were involved in, I'm going to assume to some degree, if not totally, you were involved in. Am I safe in assuming that?
I was involved in what is commonly referred to as substance abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I was there, and it was not a good experience. I spent huge amounts of money in an attempt to satisfy my addiction.
I would assume that during this time, job is either lost or about to be lost on the line, tension in the home. What are you looking like as a father now? Were the kids even aware that there was a problem?
They were aware, and, I was still able to take care of them, but still not spending the quality time with them that I recognize I should have. It was not quality time. It was more a compliance attitude as opposed to surrender with love and graciousness with my family. I did the things that I was supposed to do, but it was short.
So it sounds like the lesson there might be obviously spending more time with kids, but not so out of compliance. I think that's a safe recap.
Yeah, I think that's a very good recap, as a matter of fact. You got to do it from the heart. It's not enough just to simply to do what it is you're quote unquote supposed to do.
as I'm hearing you tell the story, I realize that it must have been pretty traumatic beginning to experience perhaps the falling away of your career, distancing from your children, and help me to understand where your wife was at the time in terms of, the relationship, what's going on, what's happening.
Well, she was just about as confused as I was. An old man once told me that a good wife is like an anchor. And I've got news for you. A good husband is just like an anchor. And unfortunately, my anchor had been cut and the boat was adrift. And because I was adrift, the family was adrift. People didn't know which way to go, what to say, what to do. People turned to other people first for advice and then to God. And it was confusion. As we know, the adversary is the author of confusion. My life was indecent and out of order, and the family suffered the impact of that. I was not leading, I was not building. Fathers should be about the business of building. I was no longer building. I was taking the house down brick by brick.
Hey guys, this is Corey, host of the Dadography podcast. This episode is sponsored by and dedicated to you. Thanks for all your feedback and support. I mean that. However, if this is your first time tuning in, please be sure to subscribe. And if you've done that already and you're getting some value from our interviews with dads from around the globe, please share. Teamwork makes the dream work. Now back to the show.
What about the decision that you and Josephine made to get a divorce? Were you guys still in Detroit at this time, and were the kids with you, or did they go back with her, and where did they go?
No, at that time we were already back in Jacksonville, Florida. We'd moved away from Detroit. I remember us driving on the freeway one day and in the middle of a snowstorm, and the car spun out of control. And as we drifted from the highway to the median, separating a 4-lane highway, all of the snow was on one side of the car, almost covering the car entirely. And me turning to my wife at that time and asking the question, "Hey, are we still alive?" And her response was, "Yes, but I think it's God's way of telling us to leave Detroit and go back home."
And so you did.
Jacksonville. And so we did. We packed up. We accepted that as a sign from Providence that it was time for the Detroit experience to end. And we went back home to our roots. She was from Jacksonville. I was from Jacksonville. So, yes, we decided to go back home to Jacksonville. And because there was this continuing deterioration month by month, week by week, and day by day, we decided it best.
And how
that we
were
part.
The conversations as it relates to the children? Did you guys give much consideration to them when you were making that decision to get the divorce?
I think it was probably more husband and wife.
Okay.
Than anything else. And there was great disappointment, obviously, and great depression because we had known each other as children before we got married and had hoped things would go well. Things had gone so well to begin with, then rapidly became a big failure.
I guess in terms of depth, and that's perhaps a little bit subjective, but how deep did this addiction go? Did it bring you down pretty far from? I mean, I'm just thinking because you at one point were on the news, doing 6 o'clock local news there in Jacksonville, Florida. At another point, you're heard on radio all the way out to 500 plus military ships. Then you're on a syndicated radio show. And so you're, as I said earlier, for all intents and purposes, a celebrity. And now you're going through this. How deep does it go, man?
Well, in the business of addiction, what we talk about is hitting bottom. And it took a while for me to hit bottom. But when I hit it big time. So that I have experienced living on the street in several cities. I experienced living in abandoned houses, abandoned cars, sometimes having to sleep in service station restrooms because there was no other place to go. Then, of course, the phases of going to drug treatment programs. Went through several of those. And yes, it was a extreme awakening in terms of hitting bottom, living on the streets with people who clearly did not care for themselves, much less anyone else. It was an ugly experience, something that I wish no one else.
You said you wouldn't wish this on anybody, Ben. If you could give any words of advice to perhaps a dad who may be listening, struggling with abuse, alcohol or controlled substances, what? And maybe it's not so. It hadn't got to the depths that yours did as of yet. But what words of advice would you give to that guy, and how would you encourage him?
Well, what you want to do is stop, and if you can't do it 1 month at a time, do it just for today. I can tell you that if you are involved, it's not going to get any better. It's only going to get worse, and it only leads one of three places. It's going to lead you to jail or the cemetery. And along the way, you'll lose your family and all that you believe in. My suggestion is that you lay it at the altar and ask God to help you. He will. That's what fathers do. Fathers look out for their children, not just in good times, but when things are going bad. Fathers look out for their children, and God will look out.
So life goes on, and you, with a number of treatment and times, you have been able to get past that period of your life. And at present, you are the owner of a call center there in Jacksonville, Florida, as well as the founder of a civil rights organization, the Northside Jacksonville Coalition. Is that right, Ben?
Northside Coalition of Jacksonville. We are a civil rights organization, and we stand up and we speak out against any and all forms of social, racial, and economic injustice. That is what we do.
So being an entrepreneur, being a civil rights activist, what is it like now with your children? Obviously, the recovery from such a trying period in your life is applaudable. But now, what is your relationship like with your children these days?
Well, it's certainly much different, but the good part about it is the role that God can play in a person's life. You know, we all have a certain calling, we all have certain gifts, we all have certain talents and skills, and God brought us back together again. Reconciliation is the story of bringing together those things that were separated before. And I'm telling you that God the Father looked out for me and allowed me to rekindle and reconcile my relationship with my two adult children. We work together now in business. And You just can't beat God giving that he would allow us to come together again after all these years. But again, that's what happened in the story of the prodigal son. He went off and played and lived a life that was boisterous and full of parties and fun until he ended up in the pig pen and recognized that he was living worse than some of his father's servants. And he went back home. He went back to his father. Imagine what it must have been like to that father, seeing his son come down that road before offering him a nice robe and a feast in his honor. Imagine what it must have been like, because he'd looked down that road so many times before and did not see his son. But finally his son returned. Imagine what it was like for my children who had looked down the same road, wondering where their father was, and then looking up one day and finding me. We came back together again, and it happened not because of our own flesh, but because of the power of God and the role that he played in our lives. God the Father, and the Father I am to my own children. That is what this story is all about. Fathers care about their children, and children care about their fathers. So now we're back together again and actually working together on a daily basis. Makes you just stop and say, ain't God good? And the response, of course, is, yes, he's good, and he's good all the time.
So at present, right, you three guys are all working together. What are your interactions with them like? Are you constantly giving advice? I'm just thinking in terms of there was a window there where there was time lost, right? And ill feelings and feeling bad, and as you just beautifully explained, missing you. And so now that they have you, what active role are you playing in their lives?
Well, probably a role that they both think is too active. Actually, we live together as well as work together. And as any good parent, I am constantly offering advice, and sometimes when it is not requested or needed. But they actually, they listen to me sometimes. And I'm thankful that I think the umbilical cord is never truly ever severed from motherhood or fatherhood. And that is where we are. They actually sometimes actually need my advice. And of course, I am more than willing to offer and give it. We have a great relationship. And now that they're older, they're able to offer me good advice. And I don't mind telling you, I accept it warmly. Sometimes I really need to listen to them.
Well, what is it like? What is it like working with them? I mean, how is that?
Oh, it's fun working with them. They're both very sharp folks. They're good administrators, good managers, and it's a joy working with them. It is something that I never, ever expected that I would end up with both of them working with me. So now we get along pretty well. We listen to each other. We make corporate decisions together.
Sounds like you guys are pretty close, to say the least.
We are very, very close. And I consider it to be a tremendous blessing to be able to communicate with my children, my adult children, and to laugh with them just as hard sometimes as we did when they were young.
Ben, if you had to summarize fatherhood in your own words, how would you do that? What would you say, man?
I would just simply say that, to me, the kingdom principles of fatherhood indicate that we should be builders. We should provide the building blocks for our children as they grow up and come into the world and live in society. We must give them what they need to make it. They say that it takes a village. But before the village comes in, there's mama and there's papa. And fathers play a tremendous role in terms of the role that young men see, how they should conduct themselves with their families. And as daughters see what they're looking for in a man, we play a tremendous role. We must always be careful and to recognize that with our children, where their hearts, their minds, their bodies, and their souls are, we're always on the air. The camera is always on us. And that the best way to teach is by example. So that the lifestyle that we lead should be exemplary of what we'd like to see in our children when they grow up. But we've got to be fair by our children and to understand that this thing called life, it can be difficult sometimes. It takes a little bit for a lot of us to even catch on this journey called life, so that when the children stumble and fall, we should be understanding and not so harsh, and to let them know that nothing beats a failure but a try. And despite the position where they end up, whether they're standing tall receiving medals or whether they're falling down and receiving the abuse of others, that we will remain with them and that we will love them no matter what. Love conquers all. Tell your children that you love them while they're able to hear you say it and while you are still able to say it. The strongest words you will ever say will always be, I love you.
Well, Ben, we thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's truly been a pleasure. Really grateful for all the insights you've shared with us. And I want to express to you my appreciation for your transparency, your ability to just share the struggles that you've gone through. But it's good to see that you were able to bounce back. And at this juncture, as an entrepreneur and civil rights activist there in Jacksonville, Florida, it is really an honor to be able to know you and to have spoken with you.
Good to be on Dadography and continue to do the good work of sharing positive things with folks with the thought that it might help somebody out there in the world today. It might help a father talk with a son, or a father to talk with his daughter, or to tighten up that relationship that sometimes can be a little bit rocky. Thank you for all that you do and for this program.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for being on the show today. I appreciate you setting aside the time to be with us, man. We'll definitely make use of all the knowledge you've shared with us today.
God bless you and thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Today's fatherhood insight comes from entrepreneur and civil rights activist Ben Frazier. Having experienced some real highs and real lows, Ben offered an insight worth remembering and contemplating. Fathers should be builders, building on the well-being of their children for the span of a lifetime. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dadography podcast. Thanks very much for listening. I would, however, like to invite you to be a part of the show. Visit our website at dadography.net. Scroll down to the bottom of the page, click on the microphone, tell us your name, where you're from, and what fatherhood means to you. Remember, it takes more than DNA to be a dad.